The most overrated armies in the world, the Russian army. The army that was supposed to take Kyiv in 3 days. The Russian army entered the 20th century with a massive reputation. Heir to the Soviet war machine, second largest military power on Earth, equipped with thousands of modern tanks, and a nuclear arsenal that still commands respect. On paper, they looked unstoppable. Western analysts predicted Ukraine would fall in 72 hours. The invasion of Ukraine exposed a hollow force. Modern tanks ran out of fuel in the first week. Cheap tires burst on highways. Soldiers used unencrypted civilian radios that Ukrainian farmers could intercept. Systemic corruption had rotted the force from within. Generals had been selling fuel and spare parts for decades. What looked like a superpower turned out to be a paper tiger with nukes. But here's the shocking part. Much of Russia's elite equipment never existed. Entire battalions on paper were ghost units. Money meant for maintenance went into oligarchs' yachts. The world discovered that Russia's military might was the greatest bluff of the 21st century. Saudi Arabia, the fifth largest military budget that can't beat sandal-wearing rebels. Their hangars are filled with American F-15 fighter jets and the latest generation Abrams tanks. They spend billions every year on cutting-edge technology. On paper, they're a regional powerhouse. In reality, it's a different story. In their intervention in Yemen, they struggled to fight Houthi rebels who use guerrilla tactics and cheap drones. Despite overwhelming technological superiority and air dominance, the Saudis were unable to secure a victory against an opponent with a fraction of their resources. The war dragged on for years with mounting casualties and international embarrassment. But the problem isn't the equipment. It's everything else. Wealthy officers with no combat experience, troops with little motivation, no coherent military doctrine. It turns out that buying the best weapons in the world means nothing without the training, discipline, and will to use them effectively. North Korea, one of the world's largest armies that can barely feed itself. North Korea maintains one of the largest standing armies in the world in terms of head count. They project an image of fanatical discipline, goose-stepping soldiers, and military parades that look impressive on state television. The regime wants you to believe they're a credible military threat. They're not. It's essentially an armed museum. Most of their equipment is Soviet scrap from the 50 seconds and 60 seconds. They don't have enough fuel to train pilots properly. Soldiers are frequently pulled from duty to work agricultural harvests because the country can't feed itself. Their ability to wage a prolonged conventional war is extremely doubtful. Their artillery pointed at Seoul is dangerous, and their nuclear program is real. But in an actual war requiring logistics, fuel, spare parts, and modern tactics, the North Korean military would likely collapse faster than people think. It's a force built for parades and propaganda, not prolonged combat. France 1,939 to 1,940. The best army in Europe that fell in 6 weeks. France entered World War II with what many considered the best army in Europe. They had the impenetrable Maginot Line, a defensive fortification that was supposed to make invasion impossible. They had more tanks than Germany. They had the manpower. On paper, they were ready. In reality, they were living in the past. Their leadership was old and slow. When Germany used blitzkrieg, the French command structure suffered a psychological collapse. Confusion reigned. Orders contradicted each other. The supposedly invincible French army crumbled, and the entire country fell in just 6 weeks. But the Maginot Line actually worked. Germany just went around it through Belgium. The problem wasn't French fortifications or even French soldiers. It was a complete failure of imagination and leadership. They built the perfect defense for the last war, not the next one. Fascist Italy, 1942. 1943. Mussolini promised to revive the Roman Empire. He boasted of millions of bayonets ready for conquest. Fascist propaganda painted Italy as a military powerhouse, ready to dominate the Mediterranean. The reality was less impressive. Much less. Italy became the Axis power's weakest link. Their equipment was obsolete. Their tanks were literally called steel coffins by their own soldiers. They suffered humiliating defeats in Greece and North Africa. Their performance was so poor that Germany had to constantly divert troops to rescue them, weakening their own operations. They had the numbers, but numbers mean nothing when your soldiers don't want to be there. Imperial Japanese Army, 1,937 to 1,945. The Imperial Japanese Army carried a fearsome reputation. Soldiers with the Bushido spirit. Fearless warriors who never surrendered. Supposedly invincible in jungle warfare. Their navy was world-class. But their ground forces? That's a different story entirely. The Japanese army was technologically backward compared to their navy. Their tanks were too light and poorly armored. Their artillery was weak compared to Allied forces. They relied almost entirely on fanatical, suicidal tactics, which caused casualties but didn't win strategic battles against American firepower or Soviet mechanized forces. When Japan fought the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol in the late 1932, they were absolutely crushed. Soviet armor and tactics exposed just how outdated Japanese ground warfare was. But the lesson was ignored. Prussia 1806. Prussia was considered the war school of Europe. The army of Frederick the Great had been legendary. Prussian military discipline and tactics were studied across the continent. They had a reputation for invincibility. But they made one fatal mistake. They stopped evolving. By 1806, Prussia was fighting with tactics from 50 years earlier. When they faced Napoleon at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt, they were annihilated. The Prussian army, supposedly the finest in Europe, was destroyed by a French army that was faster, more flexible, and more modern. The defeat was so humiliating it forced Prussia to completely reinvent itself. The Prussian collapse was as much psychological as tactical. They simply couldn't comprehend how warfare had changed. Ottoman Empire, 19th century. The Ottoman Empire had conquered Constantinople and terrorized Europe for centuries. At its peak, it was one of the most formidable military powers on Earth. But by the 19th century, it had become a bureaucratic shadow of its former self. Europeans literally called it the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans consistently lost territory to Russia and European powers throughout the 18th century. They refused to modernize their command structures, internal corruption was rampant. They survived mainly because Britain propped them up to prevent Russian expansion, not because of any actual military capability. The empire had the resources and manpower to remain relevant, but bureaucratic inertia and resistance to change killed it slowly. By World War I, they were essentially a German client state. Qing Dynasty, China, Opium Wars. The Qing Dynasty ruled what they called the Middle Kingdom. China was vast, wealthy, and had seemingly unlimited human resources. They viewed themselves as the center of civilization and foreigners as barbarians. That sense of superiority would cost them dearly. They were completely isolated from the Industrial Revolution's military applications. When the British showed up during the Opium Wars, Chinese forces faced Royal Navy warships with wooden junks and soldiers with spears against modern artillery. The military humiliation was absolute, despite absurd numerical superiority. China's leadership simply couldn't comprehend how far they'd fallen behind. They assumed their traditional methods would prevail through sheer numbers. Instead, they discovered that 1,000 men with spears can't stop a steam-powered gunboat. The shock shattered Chinese confidence for generations. Soviet Union Winter War, 1939. The Soviet Union entered the late 30s as a communist giant with seemingly unlimited resources. Massive population, huge industrial base, millions of soldiers. On paper, they looked unstoppable. Stalin wanted to project strength. The Winter War against tiny Finland seemed like an easy opportunity. Stalin had executed almost all his competent generals in purges years earlier. When the Red Army invaded Finland, Finnish soldiers on skis humiliated them in the forests. Soviet tactics were rigid and incompetent. They eventually won through sheer brute force. But the performance was so pathetic that it convinced Hitler that invading Russia would be easy. The Soviet casualties were staggering, possibly 10 times Finnish losses. They exposed every weakness in Soviet military doctrine. Stalin's army looked like a paper tiger, and the whole world saw it. Iraq, 1,991. Saddam Hussein commanded what was supposedly the fourth largest army in the world. They were veterans of a brutal 8-year war against Iran. They had Soviet tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and battle-hardened troops. Western analysts predicted the Gulf War would be a grinding, bloody conflict with thousands of American casualties. They had numbers, but not technology. Iraqi T-72 tanks didn't have night vision. They literally couldn't see American tanks destroying them from kilometers away in the dark. The Iraqi army disintegrated in 100 hours of ground combat. It wasn't a war, it was target practice. But the technological gap was only part of the story. Iraqi morale was terrible. Conscripts didn't want to fight for Kuwait. Command and control collapsed immediately. Units surrendered en masse. The whole force structure was built on sand. Don't forget to like and subscribe.